Chapter 1, just a touch summary, Izuku's quirk awakens, with disastrous results. Chapter text: Izuku Midoriya was ordinary. Other than his green hair, which somehow wasn't a result of a quirk anywhere on his family line, his tendency to mumble his thoughts and the strange feeling he'd been feeling for the past few weeks, he was completely ordinary. Too ordinary, in fact, for some people's liking. Izuku still hadn't manifested his quirk yet, which should have come sometime around his 4th birthday, but he was about to turn 6 and still hadn't shown any sign of a quirk yet. The doctor he and Mom had gone to had said that he had a quirk factor, whatever that was, and that his x-rays showed that he had the bone structure of an evolved person, but that his quirk just needed some time to really settle, was the word he used. That doctor was funny. He spoke about quirks like they were alive, like they felt things and could do things other than what their user wanted. That wasn't right. Was it? It was a Tuesday, so Izuku was at school. He liked school, he could learn so much from his teacher. Numbers, words, how to put them together, and much more. Izuku didn't really get what it meant, but Kaken called him a nerd. He had asked Mom what it meant right after Kaken had said it to him, but she just laughed and told him to not worry about it, which just made him worry even more. Izuku decided that he didn't like it when people didn't tell him things, especially when they were about him. It just seemed so backwards to him, but he could let it go if it was Mom. Speaking of Kaken, there he was. Kaken wasn't his real name, that was Katsuki Bakugu, but Izuku always got tripped up when trying to say Katsuki when they had first met, so he had been fine with being called Kaken. Kaken had never had a problem with words and names and stuff, so he could just call Izuku by his real name, which was so cool. Kaken was Izuku's best friend, but Izuku wasn't sure that Kaken felt the same way. It was strange, but Kaken had started to be a lot meaner than he used to be. Kaken had always been a bit rude, but it had gotten worse lately, focusing on him alone. Maybe it was because his quirk hadn't come in yet? Maybe Kaken was getting impatient to start their training? The two had talked about becoming heroes together, but what if Kaken didn't want to wait to see if his quirk was worthy of a hero? They both knew that Kaken's quirk, Explosion, was perfectly suited for heroics, but what if Izuku's quirk was something that couldn't be used to be a hero? What if he had a quirk that could only be activated through singing? Or made him break his bones every time he used it? What if his power was to see ghosts? It wasn't unheard of for quirks to be really different from the quirks that made it, but Izuku didn't think he could handle all that, and hoped that he just had a kinda different version of Mom's quirk, like the doctor had said. Hey! Izuku! What are you doing over there? Kaken asked. Izuku looked over, across the room, at Kaken, who was playing with letter blocks in the corner. He had been playing with them for a few days, making longer and more complicated words every time. Kaken had made a swear once, and that had gotten him the light punishment of not getting to go outside for playtime like everyone else the next day. He had been back at it the day after that, though, but had stopped trying to make words that would get him in trouble. Izuku admired Kaken's persistence, and wanted to be more like the boy, but it had been hard when the teasing had gotten worse, and the playful half-fights had gotten more intense. If Izuku didn't know that Kaken was his friend, he'd think that the blonde was really trying to hurt him. Kaken would never do that. Right? Hey, Kaken! Izuku said, skipping over to Kaken's spot in the corner. What are you mumbling to yourself again? Kaken asked, kind of grossed out? It was hard to tell sometimes. Oh, I was just thinking. Sometimes I think so much that my head can't hold it all, so my mouth starts to run. That's what my mom says. Izuku said. Yeah, well, stop. It's annoying, Kaken told him. Izuku felt his shoulders sag at that. It was always unexpected when Kaken decided to be mean. It was like a switch was flipped in his mind, and he insulted someone. Izuku thought that it wasn't very heroic to insult and hit people when you felt like it, so didn't understand why Kaken thought it was okay. He had been planning on asking Kaken why he did what he did, but had been called to the principal's office to get picked up for a doctor's appointment before he could. Well, no time like the present. Izuku had heard that phrase on television, and had heard a few heroes use it. He thought it meant I might as well do this, but he could have been mistaken. Kaken liked to tell him that he was. Kaken? Izuku said. Yeah? What is it? Kaken asked, not looking away from his blocks. Izuku faltered. Spit it out, nerd. Kaken said, standing up to his full height, just a bit taller than Izuku. Why do you hurt people? Izuku asked. Kaken was quiet for a long time after that. Izuku realized that his shoulders were hunched, his eyes were screwed shut tightly, and he was shaking ever so slightly. It was what he had seen Mom do when Dad was around. He wasn't around often, but when he was, there was a lot of shouting that made Izuku feel like it was about him. He'd asked Mom about it once, but she had just said to not worry about it. He still did. Every now and then, he'd catch what they'd yell about. He knew it was him. About his quirk, or lack of one. He had a quirk, though. It just needed some time to fully come in. Dad knew that, so why? Why yell at Mom? Why? Do the things he did when he thought Izuku wasn't looking? Izuku supposed that was what this was really about, Dad. Kaken was kind of like a proxy, in that regard. Izuku had learned that word recently, proxy. He liked it, and used it wherever he could, which wasn't a lot, he'd found. Kaken didn't like when Izuku used words that he didn't know. Izuku forced himself to focus. He had to find out why Kaken liked hurting people, not just with his words, but with his quirk and fists, too. Maybe it would explain some things about his parents' relationship. I'm just putting people in their place. They're the ones pathetic enough not to fight back, so it's really their fault. Why? Kaken finally answered. No. That couldn't be right. No way. You shouldn't hurt people just because they deserve it, even if they do. That's something a villain would do, not a hero. It was impossible that someone as great as Kaken could even think something like that, let alone believe it. Izuku had to get some air. He had to. Why was everything so loud? No, it was quiet. Izuku didn't know what was going on. It was like someone had put a rubber band around his chest, he couldn't breathe. He looked around, pleading with his eyes for someone to help. He locked eyes with Kaken, who just looked at him strangely and turned away. He probably thought Izuku was just being weird, like always. Izuku turned to his teacher, Mrs. Nico. She was always nice and helpful. He walked toward her, feeling an odd feeling in his chest. It was like the suffocation Izuku was feeling, but a bit different. It was like he was going to explode. A pressure was building inside him, and Izuku felt like he was going to burst if he didn't release it somehow. It was like when he mumbled, except 100 times worse. Nico looked over at Izuku, realizing that he was coming over to her, and immediately dropped to the ground in front of him, checking him for injuries. Izuku wondered if his pain was really that visible on his face, but then felt that he was struggling to keep his eyes open and was clutching his hands around his throat, so yes. It was. Izuku let his teacher check him over, vaguely noting that the class had stopped what they were doing and were now staring at them. Once Izuku's body was clear of injuries, Nico looked up at him and tried to get him to focus on her, but it didn't work. What's wrong, Izuku? Nico asked. I can't breathe. Izuku managed to gasp. Did anybody see what happened? Nico called out to the class. Izuku wanted to tell her. The words were right there. Kaken said something horrible, and now I feel sick. They wouldn't come, though. They were stuck with the vomit that was trying to make its way up his throat, that he was barely holding back from releasing. He settled for pointing at Kaken with a weak, shaky finger. What? Don't look at me, nerd. This isn't my fault. Kaken yelled. I know, Katsuki. This isn't something your quirk can do. Did you see what did happen, though? Nico asked. Izuku asked me a question, and then he just started choking or something. I don't know. If the weirdo can't even breathe properly, I say let him die, Kaken said, grinning like he had just won the Olympics. Izuku couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kaken wanted him to die? They'd been friends since he could remember. Why would he want Izuku to die? That was like wishing for his mother to die. It was disgusting. Vile. Villainous. Izuku curled in on himself, the aching feeling of the pressure building inside him intensifying as he went further down the rabbit hole in his brain. He was beginning to feel a little more used to the aches now, but they were only growing more intense and painful. Katsuki. Go wait outside. I'm going to be having a talk with you about your behavior. Nico said, a stern look on her face for possibly the first time. Kaken looked like he had just seen a ghost, which may as well have been accurate. As far back as Izuku could remember, Kaken had never faced any consequences for his actions, like pushing other kids around and saying mean things. Even in front of adults like his parents, Izuku's parents, and even strangers, no adult seemed to bat an eye when Kaken did something wrong, but if Izuku couldn't do something on the first try, they immediately began to harp on him like he had killed their dog. It was a morbid analogy, but it was fitting for the look of disgust and betrayal on the faces of people who found out that he was functionally quirkless. He hated that look. As Kaken slowly made his way toward the door, Izuku felt something inside him change. It was like the pressure had shifted, somewhat, like he was able to control it. Instead of building from his chest, the pressure was now flooding through his arms, pulsing with his heartbeat. Maybe this pressure wasn't a panic attack, like he had learned about from his mother, but what if this was a quirk? Mom had a quirk in her hands, so it would make sense that, if quirks were passed down from parent to child, his would be in his hands as well. The few times that Dad had described his quirk, he had said it was like a heat rising from his chest and out of his mouth, so that explained the building pressure. So, what? What was this pressure leading to? The door closed, and that brought Izuku back to the current situation. He held onto Nico tightly, crying into her as his hands throbbed painfully. The pressure was still building, and it reached a breaking point as Izuku wished for it to stop, no matter how. He didn't care if he had to drink quirk suppressants for the rest of his life, he just wanted this to end. Then, it ended. Then, Nico started to fall apart. Izuku watched as cracks started to spread over Nico's body, spreading from where he was holding onto her. She saw what was happening, the spiderwebs of pain and blood spreading over her entire self, before she smiled at Izuku, a part of her lip having a crack on it and bleeding down her face. She must have seen how afraid Izuku was, because she put her hand on the back of his head and pulled him in for what she knew would be the last hug she'd give. He felt his feet hit the ground as he fell through what remained of Nico. It was. Izuku couldn't look. Nico had separated into a variety of differently sized chunks of meat and bone and blood. The chunks fell around Izuku, surrounding him in a giant puddle of blood. He knew that some of the blood had sprayed him in the face, but he wasn't really registering physical sensations. His mind was more than making up for it, though. Izuku cried, trying not to look at the remains of Nico's body. He couldn't get the sounds of squishing meat and wet impact sounds out of his mind, along with the look of understanding Nico had given him, along with her sweet smile, before she had fallen apart. It was like his brain itself was undergoing the same thing she had, focusing on so many different things about this situation at once that it was ripping itself apart with the effort. He looked up at his classmates, realizing that most of them were crying, screaming, and trying to run away. Some were just sitting, clearly in shock, unable to do anything but stare at the body. Izuku stood up, but immediately felt weak, and collapsed back onto the floor. He braced himself with his hands, and it happened again, only bigger. From the point where Izuku's hands touched, what seemed like 1,000 cracks and lines spread across the ground, growing and splintering off to cover the entire floor of the classroom. He looked at the cracks with a sort of morbid curiosity, wondering what the biggest thing his quirk, if this even was a quirk, could affect. It took him a moment to realize that, as well as crawling up the walls, the cracks were also spreading across the other kids, making them cry as their legs slowly fell apart as they tried to run away from the quickly disintegrating floor. Izuku looked around the classroom, seeing the different kids he had been in class with peacefully just that morning rip themselves apart trying to escape this new power. He knew that the pressure in his arms was decreasing, pulsing less harshly in his arms, giving way to dread as he realized that the same thing that happened to Nico was happening to them. They were dying. He was causing it. He had to do something. Izuku knew that this power, this death, was coming from his hands, so he quickly lifted his hands off the ground and looked back up. The spread of the destruction had stopped, but the damage had already been done. The floor was a sheet of loose pebbles, ripped apart by his new power. The walls had started to crumble, but he had managed to stop it before it got serious. Izuku looked over the damage he had done, and counted that about half the class was dead. They were in piles of themselves, meaty heaps that were slowly leaking out blood and other bodily fluids. The other half of the class all had some sort of injury. Some legs had been destroyed, some arms, but everyone had at least one limb that had been ripped apart, except for Izuku. He was perfectly fine. With a sense of sick satisfaction, Izuku noted that the odd feeling he had been trying to identify for the past few weeks had vanished. He figured that it was his quirk, trying to activate itself, but Izuku had just pushed it back with anxiety medication and nausea pills. Izuku chuckled, but caught himself before he could actually start laughing. He wasn't enjoying this. He wasn't. Just then, the door opened again. Kaken walked toward the classroom floor, or what was left of it, but paused when he saw what had gone on while he was outside. What the fuck happened? Kaken asked, staring at Izuku's unharmed body in contrast to the various states of disintegration. Kaken! Izuku called out, his throat drier than it had ever been. Kaken's face twisted from confusion to disgust to anger. Izuku wondered if he had connected the dots that fast, but it wouldn't have been hard to guess that the only person still left standing in a room of death and amputation was the sole culprit. Izuku stepped toward Kaken, only to have the boy step away, steering clear of him. Izuku let out a choked sob, letting out some of the mix of emotions he'd been holding in. What the fuck did you do, Izuku? Kaken asked. Kaken's eyes darted to the small crater where the chaos had spread from. Izuku knew that the room was in bad shape, which was definitely an understatement, but where Kaken looked next was what confused Izuku. His head. Not his face. Higher, in his hair. Izuku reached up to touch it, and felt that it was dry and tangled in itself. That would be tough to comb out. His hand dropped to the side, but Izuku's eyes caught that a few hairs had ripped from his head with it. The hairs were a pale, washed-out blue color that made him drop the hairs immediately. Izuku stepped away from the hair, which he had accidentally dropped in a pool of Nico's blood. Blood wasn't the best for use as a mirror, Izuku found out, but it reflected enough to let Izuku see that he had a much lighter tone of hair than he had before, which meant that bluish-gray color was now his natural tone. He gripped his hair, trying not to think about all the lives he had ended with this power, just for it to give him a bad dye job in return. He wished for whatever this was to just kill him, too, but it never did. It just left him to feel the pain of having ended all of those lives, killed all of those kids. None of them had deserved a thing, but the universe had decided that he just had to suffer. That day, Izuku Midoriya learned a new word. It would turn out to fit this new quirk perfectly. It meant destroy, but with much darker implications than just break or crush. The doctor had said it offhandedly, but the more Izuku learned about his quirk, the more it seemed to line up perfectly with what he was capable of. A week later, when Izuku and Mom went to the quirk register to get Izuku's power registered, they put that word in as the name. Decimation. Chapter 2, The Dragon's Den Summary. Izuku spends some time at home, but things escalate. Chapter text. Izuku was at home. He had been at home for a week or so. His mom and dad were trying to get him to use his quirk, but he hadn't been able to for some reason. It was like it wasn't even there, or like it was just under the surface, stubbornly refusing to work for him. Maybe he was quirkless? Maybe he just didn't have a quirk, and that was why nothing was happening when he tried to do something with this hypothetical quirk. He had been told that it had the power to decay things, cracking them into pieces over a period of time, usually short, but he didn't remember that. He only remembered going to school one day only to not remember any of it past the beginning of playtime. So, they were waiting on the quirk counselor's results. They had tested Izuku in all kinds of ways to get his quirk to respond, but if he was being honest with himself, which he thought he was, he kind of wished he didn't have the quirk they said he did. They had called it decimation, and they had told him that he had manifested it at school. That already didn't sound very good to Izuku, but they had said that it had the ability to instill a sort of decay onto anything he touched with his hands. Izuku had immediately asked if he had done that to a person, but the doctor had refused to answer, instead getting Izuku to talk about other quirks. It had worked, of course, but now, a few hours later, Izuku had realized that the man had tricked him out of his worry. A few things had happened to his body that he couldn't explain, though. His hair had gotten a lot lighter, being almost blue with how light of a green it was. It was strange. It must have happened on the day he couldn't remember. Maybe he went to the hairdresser's. He really didn't know. Another was that his fingertips were really calloused. Just the tips of his fingers were far tougher than anywhere else, like he had been doing hard labor for years. It was strange, but not unwelcome. It helped him not get sore fingers after playing Quirk Brawl 3 all afternoon, but that was about it. So, Izuku was slowly sneaking into his mom and dad's room. It was more mom's room, because dad wasn't around a lot. He vaguely remembered asking Kaken something on the day they had said his quirk manifested, but all he could think of was his dad. When he thought back to that day, he couldn't remember a whole lot, just a few odd faces of his classmates and an overwhelming anger. Izuku didn't consider himself an angry person, not like Kaken, so what had happened? Had he really used this decimation quirk to hurt somebody? That was what he was going to ask mom and dad about. He reached the door, but hesitated. Izuku tried to move his hand, but he couldn't. Why? Oh, there were voices behind the door. He didn't know why, but Izuku had always had trouble with talking while someone else was having a conversation. Dad had said it was because people wouldn't like him if he butted in, but Mom had said it was because he was nice enough to let people finish their thoughts before voicing his own. He liked Mom's explanation a lot more than Dad's. His was mean, and Izuku didn't think it was true. Mom's was nice, and he thought it made him a better person. It was always like that. Mom just had this way of talking that always made him feel better, like whatever happened could be fixed by her saying just a few wise words. He really loved his mom. The voices were getting louder. Before, they were quiet, like they were trying but failing to remain small and unnoticed. Their apartment was small, and had thin walls, so it often ended up backfiring when they tried to keep quiet during one of their arguments. It just made it even more obvious they were fighting. Izuku stepped back from the door, knowing that he was too close to the fight for his liking. He listened, with bated breath, as Mom and Dad fought. Hisashi, you don't get to just walk away when something goes wrong. This is a family. Families stick together, even when one of us struggles with something, Mom yelled. Izuku wondered what this was about, but kept quiet. He always struggled to tune out the sobs of his mother whenever his parents fought, and now that was coming to a head as he fought with himself to not walk in there and give her a massive hug. He knew that a hug always made things better, so why couldn't Mom and Dad just hug it out? They could say whatever they had to say, but they still loved each other, right? Not this shit again. Do you really think that I'm gonna sit around and wait for what happened at the school to happen here? We should just let him go, Inko. He's a threat to everything around him with a quirk like that. Dad yelled back. With a quirk like what? Like a villain? Mom asked. Dad was quiet after that. Too quiet. It was like he had even stopped breathing, just to think about what she had said. Izuku didn't quite get why he had been so affected by the question, but he supposed that nobody liked a villain, so left it at that. Nobody has ever been a hero with that kind of quirk. He can kill with a single touch. He'll never be a hero. All that's left is mediocrity or villainy, and we both know that Izuku won't settle for being ordinary, Dad said, a few clicks sounding out from inside the room. Izuku gasped, but quickly put his hands over his mouth to stop himself from making any other noise. The conversation inside stopped, an eerie silence falling over the family. Izuku stepped back, trying to keep his tears from falling down his face. He hadn't heard his father talk like this before, even if he had been kind of mean in the past. This was a different person, it had to be. This couldn't be the man who had, not even a few hours earlier, warmed him up with his fire breath when he was cold. It couldn't be. This was a completely different man. This was a villainous man who hurt people. This was who his father really was, underneath the family man act. He was Dragon. Izuku had connected their quirks before, but had ignored the possibility that he could be the villain's son. It had seemed impossible, but he was talking the exact way he had seen Dragon talk in news clips. He was sure, now. You don't get it, Hisashi. Quirks aren't heroes. People are heroes. Quirks are tools that heroes can use to save people. Izuku would try to be a hero even if he was quirkless. That's how set he is on this thing. Now, and I can't believe I even have to ask you this, how set are you on being his father? Mom said. Izuku found himself agreeing with her philosophy on quirks and heroism, but what did this have to do with him? What had happened at school? What had he done with his quirk? Izuku was afraid of a lot of things, but knowing the answer to a question he really didn't want to know was a new one. He killed half his class, Inko. He turned people, children, to chunks of meat without even touching them. That's not my son. I'm not that thing's father, Dad said, snapping something shut angrily. Freezing, Izuku remembered. He remembered killing Nico. He remembered making a crater in the ground. He remembered the sight of the kids in his class, falling apart because of him. He remembered Kaken's horrified look as he scurried away from his hands. He remembered his own screams as he wiped his teacher's blood off of his face. He remembered what he did. Izuku remembered the question. Why do you hurt people? It's really their fault. Stumbling back, Izuku hit the floor with a heavy thud. The argument inside the room stopped, and Izuku knew that he had alerted Mom and Dad to his presence. What would happen? Was he going to jail? Was that why he hadn't been allowed to go back to school? He was going to rot in prison for murder? Wait, murder was only when you wanted to kill someone. Did they have enough evidence to figure out that it was an accident? Dad blamed him for what happened. Did Mom? Did Kaken? He briefly wondered if Nico, wherever she had ended up in the afterlife, blamed him. The door opened, breaking him out of his thoughts, and his father stepped out, scowling intensely. He really was the dragon. The two locked eyes, not saying anything as they tried to get their points across without words. Dad's hateful frown said it all, leave, or I will. Izuku tried to stand, but Dad lifted his hand and shot him a look so filled with rage and open disdain that it hurt him worse than any hit could. He didn't know when Mom had started shaking Dad, but she was. She was trying to get him to back away, but he wasn't moving. He just stood there, making sure that Izuku got the message. Loud and clear. The next thing he knew, Mom was on the ground. Dad was standing over her, a glow coming from his mouth that threatened to spill over into the air. Izuku knew that it was his quirk, and stood. Get away from her! Izuku screamed. Dad looked at him, a glint in his eyes that he had only seen once. On the news. Izuku felt the heat rising before he saw the glow intensify, Dad readying himself to use his quirk. He wondered for a moment if he would really use his quirk on his own son, but Izuku had heard what the man had said just moments before. He was no longer that man's son, and that man was no longer his father. That wasn't Hisashi Midoriya anymore. That was Dragon, the villain. Dragon fired off his quirk, a blast of flame bursting from his mouth. Izuku had already been moving when it had activated, so he was able to avoid it. Those times running and dodging Kaken's attacks had paid off, apparently. Not enough, though, as his forearm was still caught in the flame. The heat licked at him, but he yanked his hand out of the fire as fast as possible. If he had gotten Dragon's quirk, he would have been fireproof, or at least resistant. But, no. He had to get decimation. Izuku ran forward, toward Mom, and almost made it. He was scooped up by one of Dragon's strong hands, though, wrapped tightly around his throat. Dragon lifted him up, bringing Izuku closer to his face. The two stared into each other's eyes for a moment, both trying to find any semblance of who the other once was in their eyes. Nothing. Izuku was aware that the carpet behind him was on fire, but that could be dealt with later. As Dragon opened his mouth, Izuku remembered back. As much as he didn't want to, he thought of the day decimation had awakened. How his quirk had kept going until every finger had been lifted from the ground. With that information, Izuku lashed out. Pushing down the bile trying to rise in his throat, he put a few fingers on Dragon's face, watching as his eyes widened in horror. Nothing happened, though. Instead, Dragon started to charge his quirk, and Izuku put the rest of his fingers on that hand to his face. He started to crumble, his skin cracking and segmenting in under a second. Distantly, Izuku recognized that it was faster, now. Maybe it was because he had used it willingly. He wasn't trying to stop it, so it was working better? That made sense. Izuku saw that he was still charging his flame attack, so put both hands, with all 5 fingers on the sides of his head. After a moment, instead of chunks on the ground, Dragon instead turned into dust. Dust! Izuku fell through the small plume, hitting the ground and closing his eyes as the throbbing in his heart he hadn't known was there faded. The particles of dust that used to be Dragon fell on him, but he was too lost in his own mind to care. He just used his quirk. He had killed somebody. He killed a famous villain. Who was his father? He had turned his father, a villain, into dust with his quirk. Oh, no. Oh, no, 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 no. What was going to happen now? He had definitely meant it that time. Was he going to jail for real? Was he going to be charged with murder? He was only trying to stop him from hurting Mom, so... MOM. Izuku sat up, letting Dragon's remains fall to the floor. He looked over to where he last saw Mom, and saw that she was okay. Her face was swollen, but she was alive. That was all he needed. Izuku stood up, making sure to keep one finger off the ground on each hand. He knew that if he did to his home what he did in the classroom, that would be bad. He took a step toward his mother, but saw how she flinched back. Mom? Izuku asked, taking a step back again. Oh, Izuku. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have had to do that. My baby boy. Are you okay? Mom asked rapidly, scrambling to her feet and slowly making her way towards him. Mom fretted over him, checking over him for any injuries. When she got to the burn on his arm, Izuku blinked away the haze that had taken his mind. He had forgotten all about it. He lifted his arm to see, but all he could spot was the muscle underneath his skin, and even most of that was burned away. Now he saw why Dragon was an A-tier villain. Am I a villain? Izuku asked, only really half-conscious. What? Of course not. Izuku, believe me when I say that even worrying about it makes it so that you can't be a villain, Mom said. How? I killed him. I killed Nico. I killed the kids in my class. That's what villains do, Izuku said, his voice oddly flat. Villains kill people, yes, but they don't worry about if they're villains or not. They don't feel bad after they do bad things. That automatically makes you better, Izuku. You're my son, and I believe in you. As long as you remember that fact, you'll be whatever you want to be, Mom said, hugging him close. Izuku was making sure that he had one finger curled up against his hand when she was close. She pulled away soon, though, to request that police, firefighters, and an ambulance be sent to their home. The flames had grown since he last checked up on them, and they evacuated the house when the emergency responders came. Both he and Mom told the police everything they could, though Mom's account of things was obviously more detailed. The two were hurried into an ambulance, where the paramedics immediately got to work in calming Izuku down, who had started to hyperventilate as the adrenaline of the event wore off and he started to really feel his burn. At the hospital, the doctors told him that he'd have some trouble moving his arm for a while, but other than that, thanks to the multitude of healing quirks in the hospital, he'd be fine. It was a relief, especially since he expected to be doing a lot of movement in the future. That got Izuku thinking about what he wanted from his future. Could he still be a hero with this in his record? Could he be a hero with decimation as his quirk? Did he even want to be a hero anymore, seeing how they failed to apprehend Dragon and let him abuse his family? Was Dragon right about his quirk? Could it only kill? Was he destined to fall through the cracks and become a villain, just like him? Mom must have seen his expression get tighter and tighter, because she grabbed his good hand and held it softly. He immediately felt Dragon's grip around his throat, rough and too tight to breathe, and he started to choke. Izuku put his hands to his throat, and tried his hardest to breathe, but he couldn't. It was like Dragon was still there, trying to kill him and Mom. He gripped his throat tighter, until it hurt, but recognized that now he really couldn't breathe. Izuku let go, and his breath returned to him. He looked at his own hands, wondering why that had happened. "Are you okay, Izuku?" Mom asked. I don't know what happened. It felt like he was still here. Izuku sobbed, tears beginning to flow. "It's okay, Izuku. He's gone." "What made you feel like that?" Mom asked again. "Why you touched me, but your touch was nice and gentle, and then I was back there, feeling him choke me," Izuku explained, still catching his breath. Mom looked worried, like she knew what was happening. She held his hand again, slower this time, and nothing happened. Instead, Izuku leaned into the contact, letting them both lean on each other for warmth in the cold hospital room, and the two fell asleep after the nerve-wracking night they had both had. During his sleep, Izuku dreamed of decimation, of his hair turning grayish-blue, and of his father firing off his quirk at him. When he woke, Mom was unpacking some clothes that looked like they were for him, but they clearly weren't from his room. She had to have gone out and bought some clothes. She noticed he was awake, and gave him a sympathetic look. "They couldn't save the apartment, Izuku. I'm sorry. The place was too small and the fire spread too quickly. We have to move. I got you some clothes, so if you want, you can change into them now and we can leave right away to look for houses," Mom explained. "Okay," Izuku replied, moving to grab the clothes. He began to make his way toward the bathroom, but paused. Dragon's words kept playing in his head, over and over. "He's a threat to everyone around him with a quirk like that. He'll never be a hero. I'm not that thing's father." They wouldn't leave his mind. Izuku needed an answer, and he needed it from the one person who could still give it. "Mom?" Izuku asked, hesitantly. "Yes?" Mom turned to face him. "Can I be a hero? Even with this power?" Izuku asked. Mom frowned, and made her way over to him. She knelt before him, trying to get a good look at his face. Izuku hadn't known when he'd started looking at the ground, but he lifted his head to lock eyes with Mom. She was thinking about something, but she came up with an answer fairly quickly. Mom was smart like that. "Do you want to be a hero?" Mom asked. "No. I need to be a hero," Izuku said, tears building at the corners of his vision. "Then you will be. Do you remember what I said to you? You're my son, and I believe in you. That's never going to change. You can do anything if you want it enough. So, yes. You can be a hero, Izuku," Mom said. Izuku finally let the tears flow. He sobbed, clutching Mom tight with 8 of his 10 fingers. They stayed like that for a while, just crying, until Izuku was able to carry on. He'd do it. He'd become a hero and prove that it isn't the quirk that makes the man, but the reverse. He'd destroy the stereotype that destruction is evil. He'd become the greatest hero to ever live, and he'd do it with the quirk that had given him so much pain and grief. Chapter 3, Another Ordinary Day Summary. Izuku, now 15, prepares for UA's entrance exam. Chapter text. Izuku stepped off the bus, letting the fresh air wash over him as he made contact with the street below. He was standing outside the front gates of his school, Aldera Middle, and staring at the metal bars that lined them. He was 15 now, in his last year in middle school. He tightened his gloves, missing the middle finger on both hands, and made his way toward the gate. He had developed a habit of fidgeting with the gloves when he was nervous. It calmed him to know that others were safe from his quirk. It sucked not having a way to turn it off, but the gloves were a good enough solution for now. The 5-point activation requirement was a curse and a blessing, good for when he wanted to not decimate something, but troublesome when he did want to train his power. He walked throughout the school, making his way to his locker. It was the last day before the various students would go off to take their entrance exams for high school. Izuku was excited, not only because it was the next step in his life, but also because that meant that he was done with Aldera specifically. The school was a nightmare, and not only because of the dreadful incompetence of the teachers. The students were a collection of some of the most prejudiced, spiteful children he'd ever had the displeasure of meeting. One word from Bakugo, and they all hated him. He supposed it was at least kind of warranted, since his quirk could cause a lot of damage if he wasn't careful. The thing was, he was careful, and hadn't given them any reason to suspect that he might be willing to use it on them. He had come to accept his quirk over the years. At first he hadn't liked it, due to its ability to cause mass amounts of damage with ease. Then, as he began to train his power for the entrance exams to his chosen high school's hero track, he began to see the heroic applications of such a power. Izuku's power let him disintegrate anything he touches with all 5 fingers, including biological matter. He fought a flash of the memory of the quirk's awakening, and kept walking. All in all, it was a fairly powerful quirk, but the first time he had used it, he had accidentally killed 12 people, as well as leveled his classroom. The second time he had used it, he murdered his father. He had come to terms with that reality, but it still hurt to think that he had ended innocent lives, even if it was an accident. Izuku carried that with him, vowing that nothing like that would ever happen again. That was why he was aiming for UA, the best school for heroics in the country. He'd show people that he could be a hero, even with a villain's quirk. As Izuku arrived at his locker, he swung his backpack around to put it in, but saw that there was red paint, splattered all over the inside. Izuku took deep breaths, but couldn't help remembering the way his kindergarten teacher's blood had fallen onto him, sticking in his hair and staining his fingers. He took a step back, needing to take his eyes off the blood. No, not blood, Izuku assured himself. Paint. It's red paint. You're okay. Just remember to breathe, he thought, beginning to make his way outside. He needed to breathe, but the air in there just smelled like iron and death. He all but ran outside, clutching at the straps of his bright yellow backpack, contrasting against the black of his blazer. His therapist, Dr. Quirk, had told him that focusing on the things around him, especially color, was a good way to calm down from any panic or fear he might feel. So far, it had worked for him, but there had been a few times when his concentration had slipped and he had spiraled into a full-blown panic attack. It felt eerily similar to this creeping sensation that something was wrong that was spreading through him like poison. When he got outside, Izuku took a deep breath and sat down on a bench, making sure to keep his posture right for the breathing exercise to work. He had been taught a variety of coping mechanisms during his stay in therapy, and they had all been more than effective. He had been put into therapy after the first 2 uses of his quirk, and had gone willingly, but he hadn't been expecting it to help him as much as it had. Dr. Quirk was a miracle worker in his eyes, and the two had become good friends, despite protocol saying that you probably shouldn't form emotional connections with your client as a therapist. Being invested in progress was one thing, but it probably wasn't very good to have a legitimate friendship with a client. Something to do with a conflict of interest. Izuku didn't care, though. Quirk was amazing, and they always had a good time talking with one another. Izuku felt like he was calm now. He took a moment to check his breathing and his heart. They were both okay, well within normal limits. Looking around let him see that other people had started to arrive, and he didn't know how to feel about it. It meant that the day was that much closer to being over, but it also meant that he was that much closer to being harassed for the day. It's only a half day, Izuku, he told himself. This is kind of just a formality at this point, he thought, happy that the entrance exams for UA had finally come. It had felt like he had been training for this exam his whole life, when it had only really been about 2 years. UA held its entrance exams earlier than almost all other schools, just because of the sheer amount of applicants they have every year, needing the extra time to parse through the applicants and make the best decision they can. Izuku would think it was funny if he didn't know that the late nights and intense workload were probably hell on every staff member this time of year. He felt bad for them, but it also filled him with determination. He just had to make a big splash so that his admittance to the hero course was a no-brainer, and it didn't take them until a week before school started to get back to him. Izuku heard snickering around him and looked around. He spotted a few of his regular harassers and sighed. It was only a half day, but it would be a long one either way. Izuku stood up, gripping his backpack tight, and turned around to go back inside. He was okay now. He didn't need those assholes ruining today for him. If they did something big enough, it'd mess up his mindset going into the exam tomorrow, and he might fail. He needed to get somewhere they couldn't get him, and that meant that he had to get to the classroom before them. If he didn't, they'd have the advantage of being unsupervised. They could do anything they wanted to him. That was another thing that Izuku hated about this school, the bias. Izuku's quirk was strong, so he wasn't allowed to fight back, even without it, the school citing it as a risk to students' well-being. If anything was a risk to students' well-being, it was the mindset that just because he could kill, that meant he would. He was aiming to become a hero, for God's sake. It was that type of ignorance that had helped along the stigma around quirks being villainous and heroic. The prime example of this mindset was Katsuki Bakugo. He had a powerful quirk as well, but he was nothing like Izuku. The two were polar opposite, as far as Izuku was concerned. He'd say that the blonde had a short fuse, but he didn't really have one. Every single little thing about Izuku seemed to set him off for some reason, and he'd use his quirk to intimidate people any chance he got. The boy had an ego the size of Mike Tower, and Izuku wondered how he didn't get a migraine from screaming as much as he did. Maybe it was just a part of the natural mutations quirks instill in their users that give them some protection against their quirk's affects. Izuku knew that Bakugo's arms were built to withstand the force of his explosions, but that was about it, as far as Izuku knew. He really should quiet down, for the sake of everyone around him as well as himself. To the school, Bakugo was a shoo-in for UA, so they treated him like he could do no wrong, even though he'd done his fair share of harassment and bullying, all focused on Izuku. Bakugo took every chance he could to antagonize Izuku. He had lost count of the burn scars that littered his body from Bakugo practicing his quirk on him. Him and Inko had tried to tell the school about the things Bakugo had been doing to him, but they had refused to listen to their explanation. They had simply said that Izuku was getting rid of the competition for UA. The principal had it in his head that Izuku wasn't sure about his chances at UA, and sought to disqualify Bakugo from admittance. They all knew that was a blatant lie, but they went home, disgruntled and put down. They had been trying to go against the Bakugas in court, but that was a slow process. It didn't help that the Bakugas were fairly well off, so they'd be able to buy the best lawyers in town. Unlike the Midoriyas, who had always been squarely in the lower middle class. Izuku understood that they couldn't use any of the money his father had stolen over his career as dragon, but it still bummed Izuku out to see his mother work a job she hated to have enough money for them to live a well-rounded life. Izuku just had to get through this one last day before the entrance exams, and he'd be set. He could just tune out the rest of the unnecessary information until he got his letter from UA saying that he got in or failed. He knew that failing was a possibility, though probably not a likely thing. He had been training his body, mind and quirk for 2 years at this point, so he was fairly sure he'd get in. He had been so laser-focused on the exam that he had kind of disregarded how much he'd improved his quirk. When it manifested, decimation wasn't overly powerful. It was okay, at best, but he had improved it to the point where he was sure it was UA-worthy. Back when he was younger, the rate at which he could destroy things was much slower, taking a few moments to completely dust something. He had invented an exercise to gauge how far he'd progressed, using his quirk on a baseball. At first, he'd only been able to do it after a few moments, but now, he could do it in an instant, so he really had shown that he could improve. That had been an important one, not just to himself, but to his mother, too, who Izuku suspected had lost a bit of faith in him over the years. If he had been right, that had restored her faith in him, and they had moved on to preparing him intellectually for the written portion of the exam. When Izuku got to the classroom, he saw that the bullies he had been trying to avoid had made it there already. They were waiting for him outside the door, and Izuku groaned as he came to a stop a few meters away from them. They locked onto him, and smiled maliciously, pushing themselves off the wall they had been leaning on and standing up straight. They were both taller than him, not many weren't, and they were almost staggering toward him as they giggled to themselves about what they were going to do to him. Izuku thought it was a bit much, considering that they were openly enjoying thinking about hurting a fellow student in a public place, but that wasn't really his place, was it? At least not to these guys. "Hey, Deku," the shorter of the two, Nagayubi said. "What's up, villain?" the other, Sekiai-ken asked. Izuku really didn't know why these two bothered him. Yubi had been his friend at one point, but had moved away to a different elementary school, so he hadn't been there for the incident with his quirk. He had been told by Bakugo what had happened once they met back up for middle school, though, and he had stayed away from Izuku, eventually beginning to antagonize him just like the others. Ken was a mystery, though. He hadn't known Izuku before middle school, but had fallen in with Bakugo early on, leaving him as one of the main aggressors when it came to the bullying situation. It was a shame that Ken resorted to bullying, because his quirk could have genuinely been good for heroics. He could make his fist into a rock-like material. He would have been a pretty good hero, if it weren't for the fact that he had succumbed to peer pressure so easily. "Oh, nothing much. Just resting up for the UA entrance exam tomorrow," Izuku said, closing his fist. He had specifically designed the gloves he was wearing so that his quirk couldn't destroy them. The middle finger on both hands was missing, and so were the palms. That meant that if he closed his fist, he wouldn't fulfill the 5-point contact requirement for decimation to activate. He literally couldn't hurt anybody unless he wanted to, so why did he have to put up with this crap every single day? "You're still doing that? Give it up, Deku. Nobody's gonna take you when you've got that villain's quirk," Yubi said, saying the name Deku as if it were a curse. The name Deku had been the brainchild of one Katsuki Bakugo, of course, and it meant useless. Bakugo had come up with it a few weeks after Izuku had failed to manifest his quirk when he was 4. They hadn't heard of quirks that hid until activated, so their friend group had assumed that Izuku was lying and that he was really quirkless. The name Deku reflected that, and even though he did have a quirk, the name stuck. It was a silly thing. But it had hung over Izuku's head for the last 10 years, and he doubted if both he and Bakugo got into UA that it would go away anytime soon. Who will they take instead? A kid who can stretch his fingers and a kid who can barely pass gym? Izuku asked, looking between the boys in front of him. Okay, wrong thing to say, Izuku thought, seeing how Yubi started to elongate his fingers, and how Ken's hands shifted into their rock form. He stepped back, but felt something behind him stopping his movement. He looked back and saw Bakugo, staring at him with that same angry stare he had used that day when his quirk awakened. Izuku watched as cracks started to spread over Nico's body, spreading from where he was holding onto her. No, Izuku told himself. This isn't happening. He felt his feet hit the floor as he fell through what remained of Nico. You're okay. That's already happened. It's done, he thought, taking a step back from Bakugo's fiery red eyes. What the fuck did you do, Izuku? Kaken asked. Whoa, Deku's freaking out. Ken laughed. Kaken. Izuku closed his eyes, trying to will the bad thoughts away. It didn't work, and he stepped back only to collide with Yubi, who pushed him forward. He opened his eyes as he tripped over his own feet, plummeting to the floor the same way the chunks of Nico's remains had. He hit the ground without even trying to save himself, and opened his eyes to see Bakugo's vaguely disappointed eyes landing on him with the same expression he had held while looking at Izuku for the past 8 years. Izuku tried to get up, but Ken knocked him back down again. What's this I hear about you applying to UA, Deku? Bakugo asked, crouching down so that the two were closer together. Trying to lift himself up made Izuku realize that his arms had turned to jelly. This couldn't be happening. Not on the day before the exam. He tried to open his eyes, but found that everything was far too bright when he did, so left them closed. He shifted his body around so that he was sitting, but still under Bakugo, so he didn't have a reason to lash out. He'd probably still do it, since he didn't have a reason half the time anyway, but it was for his own safety. "I want to be a hero, Bakugo," Izuku said, trying to get the smell of iron and meat out of his nose with long, deep breaths. A strong smack to his face forced Izuku's eyes open. Bakugo had hit him across the cheek, snapping him out of his panic attack. Had he known that it would help? Or was it just luck? Izuku thought it was best not to question it. "What makes you think that a killer like you can do anything good?" Bakugo asked, his eyes boring into Izuku's soul. Izuku flinched at the word killer. It was a sore spot for him, for sure, but Bakugo was talking about the accidental deaths. Nobody knew what had happened to Izuku's father, the mother and son telling people that he was away for work. They had to lie, otherwise people would look at him, differently. They would do what Bakugo had been doing for 8 years. "I'm not a killer. It was an accident. You know that better than anyone," Izuku yelled, hating how his voice broke. "I know that you slaughtered half of our classmates. I know that you dusted a woman who did nothing but care for you. I know that you were the only one left in that fucking crater after you blew up our kindergarten class." Bakugo ranted. "I wasn't in control of myself," Izuku cried. "And you are now?" Bakugo asked, a strange tone to his voice that Izuku couldn't quite place. "Why, yes," Izuku answered, confident in his answer as the truth. "Prove it, then," Bakugo replied. What?" Izuku asked, but got no reply. Bakugo stood, looking at his buddies knowingly. Yubi and Ken stood on either side of him, and each got an arm under him. They hoisted him up violently, shaking him about as they lifted him up to his feet. The two kept him in place, holding him by his shoulders, as Bakugo grabbed one of his hands and yanked it toward him, placing his open hand on his chest. Izuku closed his eyes, thankful that he hadn't realized the glove's purpose. "Oh, right. These," Bakugo said. Izuku's eyes shot open as he felt Bakugo's strong fingers tugging at his gloves. He closed his fist, hoping to keep them on, and a battle between the two broke out entirely with one of their hands each. Bakugo pulled on the glove, trying to get it off, but Izuku kept his fist closed, hoping against hope that they stayed on long enough for someone to intervene. It was a stupid thought, that someone would even try to stop what was happening here, but he could at least hope for a little bit of human decency to survive Aldera Middle School unharmed. Actually, no he couldn't, because no one came. Bakugo finally got the glove off, tossing it on the ground as he gripped Izuku's wrist hard enough for it to bruise. For some reason, Bakugo then spun Izuku around, roughly breaking the hold his friends had on his shoulders. He was still holding onto Izuku's wrist, but he was aiming it toward Yubi. Bakugo began to drag Izuku closer to Yubi, who turned to run away, only to run into Ken's rock fist, knocking him out. Ken held Yubi up, perfectly vulnerable to Izuku's quirk. He tried to rip his hand free of Bakugo's grasp, but it was impossible. The blonde's arms were naturally far more powerful than his, on account of withstanding his own quirk for 10 years. So, let's find out if you're more than a dirty villain. If you can control your quirk, you live. If you don't, you'll have one more body on your hands, and I'll kill you for that, Bakugo hissed in his ear as he brought his hand closer to Yubi's face. It was agonizing, the few moments between Bakugo's threat and the feeling of his fingers landing on Yubi's face. Only 2 of his fingers had touched, so Bakugo kept pushing. As he got closer and closer, Izuku wished for someone to come and save him, but remembered his father's words. They had been burned into his memory, much like the patch of skin on his arm had been burned by his father's hate and rage. He'll never be a hero. Izuku bared his teeth. He summoned all the strength he could and closed his fist, pushing his fist forward instead of back. The sudden movement jostled Bakugo, and he let go. Izuku's fist connected with Yubi's face, something he felt the boy deserved, though not while unconscious. Izuku stepped back from the 2 conscious bullies, staring at them with his face set in an angrily determined expression. "I'll never kill again. I'll show you that I can be a hero even better than you," Izuku said, pointing a finger at Bakugo. "Like fucking hell you will." Bakugo roared. Bakugo leapt forward, his right hand cocked back for his famous right hook opener. Izuku didn't like it, but he'd have to resort to intimidation to get through this one. He stepped into the attack, holding his exposed hand out, his fingers splayed out as wide as he could get them. Izuku's hand was close enough to close around his face, but it was a feint. His other hand was behind his back, thrown back for a punch if Bakugo still wanted to fight after this. Seeing the fear flash across Bakugo's face shouldn't have been as satisfying as it was. Bakugo dodged out of the way, stumbling back and out of range of his hand. Izuku dropped his arm to his side, and uncurled his fist. He looked at Ken, making sure he knew that his hand was closest to him before the boy did anything stupid. The three looked at each other, before Ken and Bakugo huffed and began to leave. Izuku sighed, reached for his glove on the ground with his covered hand, and remembered how Bakugo had first reacted to his hands when his quirk had manifested. Izuku stepped toward Kaken, only to have the boy step away, steering clear of him. He had seen it back then, the fear. It was a primal one, he knew, and rational. A child's fear was always born of misunderstanding, Izuku had found. They didn't know what they were looking at, so they feared it. It was the classic human fear of the unknown, except in the eyes of a child, most, if not all, things are unknown. Izuku knew that he was just a kid, and that he couldn't have been expected to react any other way, but when Bakugo had dodged out of the way of his hand way back then, a part of Izuku had died, and with it, their friendship. With both of his hands under wraps, Izuku continued into his classroom, hoping that his morning didn't speak for how the rest of the day was going to go. Chapter 1, Just a Touch Summary, Izuku's Quirk Awakens, with disastrous results. Chapter text: Izuku Midoriya was ordinary. Other than his green hair, which somehow wasn't a result of a quirk anywhere on his family line, his tendency to mumble his thoughts and the strange feeling he'd been feeling for the past few weeks, he was completely ordinary. Too ordinary, in fact, for some people's liking. Izuku still hadn't manifested his quirk yet, which should have come sometime around his 4th birthday, but he was about to turn 6 and still hadn't shown any sign of a quirk yet. The doctor he and Mom had gone to had said that he had a quirk factor, whatever that was, and that his x-rays showed that he had the bone structure of an evolved person, but that his quirk just needed some time to really settle, was the word he used. That doctor was funny. He spoke about quirks like they were alive, like they felt things and could do things other than what their user wanted.